You'll have to tell me when to stop because I tend to ramble. So, now, mine are flowering very late this year, and typically in this country they flower about a month later. So we normally get the flower on a Satsuki between the end of May through to mid-June, sometimes a little bit later, sometimes a little bit earlier, because English weather is always predictable. Mine, as you can see, are still tight bud, all of them. We've had none in flower yet. So if we have a hard winter, they flower a little bit later. A soft winter, they flower a little bit earlier. They can flower for as long as 2 or 3 weeks, but it's not very kind to them to leave the flower on them that long. The flowering takes a lot of energy out of them. So what I would tend to do is, with a bit of wood, luck, touch wood, you get them to flower just before a show, take them to the show, and the weekend after you cut the flowers off, because that's the time you got. Generally, I wouldn't leave the flower on them more than a week, because it really does take a lot of energy out of them. And if you want a better flowering cycle, you take the flowers off early so you get some flowers next year. I've found generally that they flower best every other year anyways. So they flower, this one has never been covered in flowers, but they'll be covered in flower 1 year, and then the next year you'll get a smattering of flowers on them. So if you have something like Kaho, which is a variety that has white, pink and white flowers, it has a cycle as well. So 1 year it'll be almost all white, the next year it'll be a bit of white and almost all white with a little bit of pink, and the third year you get all 3 colours. And if it only flowers every other year in profusion, that means once every 6 years you get Kaho completely covered in flowers ready to show. Now, that would matter in Japan because you have people in Japan that will look at the leaf and say that's Kaho and that's not the right flowers. Fortunately, in this country, there aren't that many people that can do that. I can only think of 2 or 3. They're generally Hong Kong Chinese or Japanese. There are very few generally that can do that, so you're safe to show azaleas whenever they're in flower because no one's going to know whether it's in the right cycle. The reason they have this cycle is the Japanese don't name varieties in the same way as we do. If you had a chrysanthemum or a geranium that you want to name with the RHS, you'd have to grow that geranium or whatever for 3 or 4 generations to show that the colour in the flower and the shape of the flower and the growth habits of the plant were consistent over those 4 years or so. And they do all the field trials to do that, to show that that plant is stable as a variety. The Japanese don't have any of that nonsense. They see a colour of flower they like, they give it a name and they register it. That's the older of the 2 catalogues. That was the original one that was imported into this country. In there are something like 1,000 varieties. Loads and loads. And the problem with this book is that there are only 1 line in all the description that I can read. And when I say I can read it, I say it was some... That one there is a variety called Yomi-Meimon. As I say I can read it with... It's in Roman letters. Everything else in there is in Japanese characters. And probably some Chinese because they like mixing them up just to confuse me. That was fine, and Alex Kennedy very patiently went through that and listed them out in alphabetical order because there's an index in here in alphabetical order. Unfortunately, it's Japanese alphabetical order, and you have to be able to read Japanese to do it. I've not mastered that yet. So I go to Alex's little book, and you can't get this anymore. As you can see, it was a mass-produced document, stapled and printed, but it lists them in English alphabetical by name. So quite often on labels in nurseries and on your show benches, you'll see the numbers, and they're up to 3-digit numbers. And all that number is the page number in here. Because you try and say Sachi no Hikari or Sachi no Kotobuki after you've had one or two. It's much easier to say 238. That is impossible to get now. If they then made life difficult because they update their catalogue, and that was the last one that was imported into this country that I know of. And there's about 100 extra varieties in there. Now that really messes up this. So what I've done at home, I've got a spreadsheet that lists those numbers. Unfortunately, they're more or less the same as these numbers, plus 100 new varieties. And by colour and all sorts of different things. If you want the spreadsheet, I'll leave an email address and I'll email it to you. It's a big file though, it's about 100 pages. There are lots of books that will help you find your way around Satsukis. The Bible is Azaleas by Doll. It's a real hard read because it's a horticulturalist's Bible on how to grow them, what the varieties are, where they came from and all those sort of things. But it's got everything. There's a big section, I say big section, 10 or 20 pages in there on Satsuki. Because he was interested in what the Japanese were doing and what varieties. What the Japanese discovered was that with the original plants they had, there were certain colours they couldn't get. So they started bringing all sorts of rhododendrons in from around the world to try and get those colours. So the DNA in these plants is really quite confused now. If you want the information out of that, just borrow it from a library. Don't try it. That's about 100 quid's worth of book. A brocade pillar. That was a literal translation of a Japanese text and then anglicised a bit more. And it really is quite useful in terms of explaining the names and variety of flowers and how the colour patterns are named in Japanese. But most of the horticulture in there is probably as current as the original book, which is about 1600. So it's a nice reference, and it's nice to have to explain the colouring of the flowers, but after that, move on. The books that are probably best to use in this country are those three. They're all Alex Kennedy books. They're all out of print now. You can still get that one with a reasonable amount of ease, which is Floral Treasures of Japan. These two are quite difficult to get now because being paperbacks, they don't turn up in the second-hand bookshops very often. But if you can get any of those, they're worth having. Alex knew British weather, he knew the idiosyncrasies of what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So he's written around English weather and what you can and can't get in this country. Move on to the Japanese attempts, and that one is worth about as much as the paper that they use to print it. Satsuki's a wonderful, come and buy them in Kanuma. This one was quite a good attempt. It's quite informative, but it's using Japanese techniques, and if you use some of the techniques in here in this country, you'll have one variety of plant called dead. And mainly because what they can get away with in Japan is very different, because they have very hot weather, 30, 35 degrees C, maybe 40 on occasions, but they have very high humidity, 80, 90%. So they squeeze a lot of growing time out of that we just don't get. And I'll talk about pruning later on, where I'll say leave a green leaf at the end of the branch. They will actually just cut it off, because with their humidity the branch stays live long enough for it to back bud. You do that here and it's gone. They just dry out before they have a chance. The Americans weren't to be outdone, so John Lack and a couple of friends produced that one, and it's really good if you're in Californian weather and have access to Californian grown medium and stuff like that. And the pruning information in there is quite good, but after that Californian weather's just different, and the techniques they use reflect that. And that suffers with the same problem. It works in different parts of the States, and this is a mishmash of different American writers putting together their advice. So bits of it are good, bits of it are more left field. So you have to be a bit more careful how you use those books. And that's fairly much all of the published information on Satsuki's. I mean, it's ready for a haircut now. And last year, when you did that, you could see my hand under that tree. And I don't mean a little bit see it, it was very clear under there. If you collar Brenda at tea break, she'll show you a picture of half the tree pruned and half not pruned. And it's quite dramatic. They come in all sorts of varieties, so you get the exposed root style. I find these are from Ken at Windy Banks, little baskets. And I use ericaceous fertiliser to feed it, which is a slow release. It's the Miracle Grow slow release fertiliser. I use that with a bit of Biogold and some Super Biogold. I think all trees need a balance of feed. You'll see lots of books which say you need to do potash here and you need to do this here and you need to do that there, and they give you recipes for every week of every month of every year. Trees are very simple, they need food. So you start slowly with a bit of nitrogen and a balanced feed, so something like 555. And as the season goes through, you push that up a little bit higher as the trees grow a bit more vigorously. If you're really keen, towards the end of the summer you start feeding with Tomerite or something like that. In terms of food, I'm not too worried. I will use whatever I've got in the shed. Trees are like you and me. If I fed you steak and chips every night, you'd get fed up with steak and chips. So feed them a little bit of several different fertilisers over the summer. Just make sure they're balanced generally until the end of the year, when if you're going to do anything, you can bump up the phosphate a bit. The phosphate's supposed to help flowering. It's quite often said with them that they need a hard frost. I believe it sometimes, and other times I'm not sure. I've had flowers when we've had a very soft winter. We probably get a little bit fuller flowering when we've had a hard winter, but it's not dramatically different. They definitely like a little bit of cold, but not too cold. The soils that we use tend to be different to the soils you would use with normal bonsai. I use Kanuma. What's really important with them is that you use something that's lime free. Now, people will tell you these trees hate lime. The opposite is true. The Satsuki Azalea grew up originally in valleys, river valleys in Japan, which are deep-sided, soft water rivers. Very, very little calcium. So they became very, very efficient at scavenging calcium out of the system. Any calcium that came their way, they had it. That's fine when you're in a soft water area where there's not a lot of calcium, but you bring them to our part of the world, where you've got water that you stand your spoon up in with chalk. And suddenly they've got this abundance of lime, and they absorb that to the exclusion of all sorts of other good things. So they then yellow up a bit. And the yellow is because the calcium's locked up iron. The tree can't then produce the chlorophyll it needs to produce the food and the green. So how do we unblock that? You can use sequestrated iron, but much cheaper is to buy some Epsom salts from the garden centre. If you mix it up as per packet and water it on, that's fine. What I tend to do is put it on like you would salt on chips, and just sprinkle it on the surface and then water it in. A couple of weeks later, then they come up this dark green again. And this one hasn't had it, none of these have had it this year, so this one is still a little bit yellower than some of the others. That needs a dose of Epsom salt. Within 2 weeks it will be as dark as all the rest. You can probably do that every 6 weeks or so through the year if they're starting to show any yellow. Any of the trees that go chlorotic, that yellow-green, put some Epsom salts on them. They'll still couple of weeks it'll be dark green again. They're an odd plant in some ways because they have 3 to 4 sets of leaves through a year. So you'll find that in the winter they have a thick leathery leaf, and they'll suddenly flush in the spring, and you'll see that it's horrible when you see it for the first time. All of a sudden all the leaves will go yellow and you go, oh my God, what have I done wrong? And a week later it's completely covered in green, and all it's done is shed its winter leaves and it started its spring leaves. And some of them do it really dramatically, like everything overnight, and some of them are much softer and they do a little bit at a time. But the first time you see it, it's like, oh God, what have I done? They then have a summer leaf, which is fairly much what these are now, and then they switch back to winter leaves at the end of the year. So they're continuously rotating their leaves over. You'll notice that most of the trees, all the leaves are different shapes and thicknesses and feeling, and that's how they can tell what the variety is. They know that there's probably 20 or 30 original, and they can tell the lineage of the tree by the shape of the leaf. I don't know quite how, but they do. I mean, there's one gentleman down our way, he'll say, I know what that is, and he goes in the book and he looks up in the alphabetical list, and he then turns to the page and he says, oh, it's that one. And you think, no, you can't do that. And he's never been wrong. Not to my knowledge yet. And I've known him for 10, 15 years. Whenever we got a tree we don't know, we take it to Jacko and he sorts us out. I said they come in all sorts of varieties, and the Japanese like to shop on occasion, so they'll do odd things like this one we call the hockey stick. And this one's really quite difficult to keep healthy. I mean, it's coming back really strong now, and you might argue that, but 2 or 3 years ago we thought we were going to lose this tree. And it was down to, each branch was probably no more than that on the end of it. He was looking quite unhappy. We pruned it reasonably hard, fed it up. They're very hungry plants and very lazy rooted, and that's important in lots of ways. It means that when you water them, you have to water them very specifically. You don't water the house plant or a normal bonsai, you water when it feels dry. These you need to be a little bit crueler to. These you almost water like a pine sometimes. So you water them really well. These have been dipped today, so they're all still quite damp. These won't need watering again for probably 3 or 4 days, even in this weather. And in a perfect world, you'd almost, if you had the time and you were in the garden all day, you'd sit there until the leaves started to wilt, and then you'd water. The reason that's important with the azaleas is that they're what I call lazy rooted, as I said a minute ago. And if you water them continuously, the root ball will stay very small, right in the centre of the pot. It won't spread out. That's not important. If you can water consistently, you get no problems. But Satsukis are prone to root rot, and you can be watering them perfectly and still get it. And it will show quite dramatically. That was probably root rot. There was something got into the roots down here, and it shed all of that side of the tree. It's taken a long time to get it back into some sort of health, and it's going to need to be repotted, which we'll do later on, to get it a bit more over and start to regrow a crown on it. We used to use benlate, but there were problems with benlate because people were using it inappropriately and getting it into their eyes, and it was causing big problems with cataracts and eye problems, particularly in Spain, where they were using it on salad crops. And therefore it got banned. And this was a big problem because it was probably the only effective fungicide type of treatment that we had that would deal with root rot. There is nothing on the market now that you can buy domestically. There's probably some commercial products, but you need to know a nursery that will do it for you because you can't get the chemicals anymore. So you quite often hear Satsuki people talking about emergency repots. If that branch suddenly went yellow and all the rest of the tree was healthy, I would go and say there's a problem in that part of the roots. Satsukis are very, very root specific. If there's a problem, and this is a bit of a problem, this tree, because it's bent over and the branch there comes down in that quarter. But in a normal tree, if I have a problem in that part of the tree, there will be a problem in that part of the roots. One-on-one. 99.9% guaranteed. And the only way you can deal with it now is to actually get in and take out the rot early. If I'm at home, I'll use a garden hose or a pressure jet washer to wash the dirt out of the root ball at that point and get all of the old dirt out. And then I would take a sphagnum and push that ball of sphagnum into the root ball, and then mix a bit of sphagnum in with, I use Kanuma as a root potting medium, you can use whatever, but I put a bit of sphagnum moss that's chopped, mix that in with that and then repot it, and then very gingerly water it for the next 3 or 4 months to get the roots re-established. And gingerly would mean watering it, let it dry to touch, plant dry, not bone dry, and then watering it again. The wet-dry cycle is important with all bonsai, but particularly with Satsuki. The plant is prone to the usual bugs and responds to the usual treatments. So if you get aphids, Pravado. If you get greenfly, Pravado. Vineweevil, Pravado. That's going to pose a bit of a problem because this summer Pravado goes out of license. It'll be available for 3 or 4 months after that, and then it'll only be available if they re-license. Now, the way chemicals are going and the profit on garden chemicals is going down and down. And most of the problem we have with garden chemicals isn't that they couldn't get licenses, it's the cost of getting a license doesn't beat the profit. There's not enough profit for them when they're done. So they don't re-license. That's why you can't get Bordeaux solution. That's why you can't get all the old benlate and stuff like that. The cost of proving that they can be used safely is getting extortionate.
We've got a rush out license now and stop happening.
You can only use it for 6 months after the license expires. I can't, that's all I can tell you. It's like all garden chemicals. Once the license expires, there's a time clock on legal use. But it's like lots of things. I mean, if you get liverwort on here, you can sit there with a pair of tweezers plucking it out, or you can get some malt vinegar. Now, malt vinegar is not a licensed chemical, so you can't use it. But if you put malt vinegar on liverwort, it dies. Now, don't water your tree with malt vinegar, because the tree will die. When I say put it on, you get like a paintbrush and just dab it on the liverwort, and it will die. If you clean the trunk with a dilute solution of vinegar, any moss on there will die. You don't want it running off into the root ball, so put some tissue or something around the base to catch it. Little bits of vinegar, not going to hurt, because when you water it, it will just wash through. But you don't want concentrated vinegar on the roots. Satsuki pots, you'll notice all of these trees are in quite deep pots. The roots of a Satsuki are very wiry. They don't have big anchor roots, big thick roots generally. They don't have tap roots generally. Having said that, there will be varieties that do, just to spite me. Generally they have a root system which is like wire wool. And those roots don't do well in shallow pots. They need the extra depth to create the bulk of roots that you need to keep the tree healthy. So if you see a Satsuki in a shallow pot, it's for a show. The next day it will be in a deep pot, re-establishing its vigour.